Hey, chemists and biochemists. Today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the lipid class of, or the class of lipids known as fatty acids. Now, what I'm going to be focusing on today is really just the nomenclature. And I want to talk to you about basically the two different schemes that are commonly used for numbering fatty acids. Now, one thing that you'll always see whenever you're talking about a fatty acid is a kind of system that looks like this: C12 colon 1. So this 12 right here indicates the number of carbons in that fatty acid. This number 1 right here indicates the number of double bonds. Now, that alone doesn't really tell you anything about where that double bond is. However, there are two different naming schemes or schemes that are commonly used. One is the omega or N scheme, and the other is the delta system. Now, I would like to go ahead and draw a fatty acid where we can see a 12 carbon long fatty acid with a single double bond. Now, for comparison, I went ahead and I put together two fatty acids. These are both 12 carbon long fatty acids. Now, the difference between them is going to be depicted with whether they use the omega or the delta numbering scheme. So your highest priority carbon is going to be that of our carboxylic acid, carbon number 1 there. Now, if I label this C12 colon 1 delta, let's just say delta 3, and then this one over here, C12 colon 1 omega minus 3. You might also see this depicted as N minus 3. Well, let's look at the delta scheme first. So the delta scheme is going to say wherever that delta is, or whatever number follows that delta, that's going to tell you where the double bond begins. So I look at carbon number 1, 2, 3. I'm drawing my double bond between carbons number 3 and number 4. My highest priority is my carboxylic acid. Now, if you use the omega or the N numbering scheme, well, it's a little bit different. This omega or N scheme is starting from the methyl end of your hydrocarbon chain. So in that case, what we're going to do is we're going to count kind of using the methyl carbon as number 1, and we're going to count 2 and 3, and we're going to draw a double bond between the third carbon from the end and the fourth carbon from the end. So it's kind of funky to look at that because, well, what carbon does it end up on? It ends up on number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so your double bond in an omega-3 fatty acid, or C12 colon 1 omega-3 fatty acid, has a double bond between carbons number 9 and 10. Whereas the delta scheme, or the delta numbering system, has a double bond between carbons number 3 and number 4. Okay, so when you have what's known as a monounsaturated fatty acid, where there is a single double bond between these found on this fatty acid chain, it's a little just a matter of deciphering where that is likely going to be found. Am I starting from the methyl end in the case of the omega or the N numbering scheme, or am I starting on the delta end, or am I starting on the carboxylic acid or the delta end? Now, if we look at a polyunsaturated fatty acid, it gets a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a pair of polyunsaturated fatty acids so that we can look at this in comparison. So for these listed at the bottom, these two 12 carbon long fatty acids that I've drawn, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and depict them as polyunsaturated fatty acids. So I'm going to say C12 colon 1 delta 3 comma 5. Okay, so what this tells me is that my double bonds end up on carbon number 3 to 4, and then as it turns out with this one, it's going to end up on 5 to 6. Now, what that means is this is a little bit of an atypical fatty acid. So what this is showing is a conjugated fatty acid. Now, typically, naturally occurring fatty acids are going to be your non-conjugated fatty acids. So what that means is there's going to be a double bond, and they're going to be separated by a CH2, and then there's going to be a double bond. So essentially the way that looks is basically a double bond followed by a single, double bond. Now, that's something that whenever we use this C12, I'm sorry about this. Let's go back over here. That should be C12:2, not 1. So C12:2. So C12:2, omega minus 3, or N minus 3. Okay. Now, what's tough about dealing with an omega fatty acid is you have to have a little bit of knowledge of your naturally occurring fatty acids in that they are non-conjugated. Because all that this omega scheme tells us is where our double bonds begin. It doesn't tell us, or it tells us where our first double bond is. It doesn't tell us where our second one is. But instead, that's kind of the barrier to entry that you have to have. You have to have this basic knowledge that you have to have this kind of specific knowledge, not basic knowledge. You have to have this knowledge about fatty acids that they are going to be a double bond followed by a single, double. Okay, because they are non-conjugated. So what this is going to look like is we're going to draw our first double bond starting from our methyl end, second, third. So we've got a double bond here. I'm going to erase some of my green dots. My second double bond is going to be right here because I've got a double bond followed by 2 single bonds and then a double bond because this is a non-conjugated fatty acid. So double, single, double. So when it comes to kind of knowing more detail, the delta scheme is a little bit more specific. It provides more information. It identifies exactly where your double bonds are. The omega scheme doesn't really show as much information, but it's a little bit more suitable for, or suited for, naturally occurring fatty acids. Now, with all that to say, these two systems exist because they're used basically by 2 different fields. The delta numbering scheme is generally used by chemists and biochemists, whereas the omega scheme is a system that's generally used a little bit more by the field of nutrition. Now, I hope this was helpful. These are very similar to one another, but you always just have to remember, where am I starting? My methyl end or my carboxylic acid end? The delta scheme starts at my carboxylic acid. My methyl end starts with the omega system starts with the methyl end. Well, I hope that was helpful and gave you some insight into numbering and identifying fatty acids. Have a good one.